That is a nice picture. We're okay. Okay, we still have a little time. Okay, we're going to get started. I appreciate all of you coming out. I saw all of you out at camp meeting. I didn't get to talk to all of you last week, but I hope you enjoyed that. It was a good time out there, and thankfully, it was not as hot as I expected it to be. It kind of cooled off enough that it wasn't miserable sitting there. So it was good seeing all of you out there, but I'm glad we're back here. As I looked at what we're going to study tonight as we carry this on, next week we'll start looking at the Psalms in David's life once he then becomes king. And so today we're not going to look at a Psalms necessarily, but we're going to still look at that poetic side because one of those is actually recorded in Samuel. And so we're going to look at that one. But before we do any of that, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Lord, we come to you humble and grateful for the God that you are and all that you bestow to us. And yet, Lord, we know tonight that there is a lot of sadness for several families who have lost, loved ones, young ones, Lord, just ones that had so much life in front of them. And we don't understand, and yet these are the things that only you can. And so because of that, we put our hope in you. We find our peace in you and our rest in you in the midst of these things that just don't make sense. I pray, Lord, that you would be with these families, comfort them, bring your hand upon the situation. I know this is not something you intended or something you brought about, but Lord, I know that you can still step in and be a God to them when they need you more than ever. And I thank you that you care and you love them. I just pray that you would be with us tonight. Guide us through your word. Help us to see things that are sometimes rather hard to see, and help us to reflect on where we may need to look inside and continue to grow. No matter how young or how old we are, Lord, you are continuing a work in us, and I pray that we would be open to what that is, and that you would use us as your servants to carry your word and go from here. I thank you and praise you in your holy and precious name. Amen. Okay, so we are at the very last chapter of 1 Samuel. So 1 Samuel 31, and it's not a very long chapter. It's a rather gruesome chapter, I have to be honest. If this were a movie, it would be one I would not watch. It's gory and awful. So we're going to go from that, and then we're going to actually move right into 2 Samuel when we finish 1 Samuel. So let me give a little bit of reminder to what we studied a couple of weeks ago, because this is where this picks up. And so we talked about how David had been living among the Philistines for some time, and it came to a point where Achish, the Philistine, looked at him and said, well, we are about to go to war against Israel, and I want you to come alongside of me, and I want you to be my bodyguard. And so David agrees, and David is willing and ready to go to war. And yet, when suddenly another Philistine, guy is a big shot, he's coming through, and he's going, whoa, 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 whoa. What are these Hebrews doing here? I mean, we can't have them going into war and then suddenly turning on us. And so we know that God made a way out for David. And David was sent home and not allowed to go into war against the Philistines. Go into war with the Philistines, rather, against his own people. And again, had God not made that way out, this story might have gone on much different, had David actually gone up against his own people in battle. And yet the story continued with the fact that when David went home, then he finds that another group had come in and had attacked his home, had attacked, and taken everything, and had kind of destroyed the city and taken all of the men's wives and children and animals and goods and everything. And so at that point, we saw David humble himself before God. And this was when David then requested and asked God, do I go up against the Amalekites? Will you be with me? And that's not something we saw David do when he was ready to go into battle with the Philistines, alongside the Philistines. So we see David kind of like God saying, come on, my son, back in line here. What are you doing? And as I just look and look and look at that, I think, wow, what a merciful God, that even when we stray a little bit, he says, no, 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 no. Come back over here. And he provides a way out for us. So we saw that David, he went to battle against the Amalekites, and he brings home all this, and we even saw that he sent gifts on to those parts of Israel that had helped him from everything he was able to go and take back from the Amalekites. But then the story continues in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. Now remember, all this is what's going on this is what David is doing while the Philistines continue to go on to battle with the Israelites. So if you kind of picture this, David is sent home, and now he's got his own trouble on hand, so he's off wiping out a bunch of Amalekites, while the Philistines, on the other hand, are over battling David's people. Okay? And so chapter 31 picks up with that story. And it says, the Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them and were killed on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons and killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers found him and severely wounded him. So now we pick up, this battle was not going well for Israel. And how do we know it's not going well? Well, apparently, the enemy was able to get right to the king. Okay, which, there were a lot of people guarding the king, and there was a lot to get through to even get to this point. So this is a good indication that the Philistines were prevailing and were winning against Israel. And now we find Saul severely wounded and his sons dead and gone. So in verse 4, it says, then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me. So here's Saul's concern. He knows he is severely wounded. He knows he can't fight anymore. And his thought is you need to kill me. You need to end my life, or the Philistines are going to capture me and basically torture me. Okay? They were going to use him to taunt Israel that, we have your king, and we're going to torture him to death. And Saul was very, very much afraid of this. And so here he is looking at his armor bearer, and he's saying, you've got to kill me, because otherwise this is what's going to happen. There's no way out. And I think of this in this moment, when this just gives us an idea of where Saul's head was. He had no hope. You don't see Saul in this moment crying out to God in repentance and asking God for his favor. You see none of this. You see a man who is just ready, just end my life, take it, be done with it. And by the way, that armor bearer, many, many historians believe, and from other writings, historical writings and so on, remember that guy Doeg that had gone and ratted on David when he was in talking to the priests? And remember when Saul ordered that all of God's priests be killed, and all his men stepped back and said, yeah, we can't do that. And Doeg said, I'll do it. And the story goes that Doeg goes in and he kills all of the priests of God. Wasn't exactly a very good guy. And yet, from all the other accounts of history, it tells us that this was probably the guy who Saul had right by his side as his armor bearer, was this guy. And so now here's Saul, and he's looking at Doeg, and he's saying, you know what, draw your sword, run it through me. I don't want to be tortured by these guys. But his armor bearer would not do it because he was terrified. Now, what was he terrified of? Well, if he ended Saul's life and went home, they'd kill him anyways, because his job was to protect the king at any cost, not certainly to take it into his own hands and kill the king. And so no way was he going to do this, because one way or another, he was a dead man. So Doeg, he's going, So then here's Saul. And this is the saddest part, and I know some of the other things we've talked about prior to tonight's study, of where, we have different young people that just feel like there's no other way out. And this was Saul. He did not turn to God. He did not cry out to God. He was so far from that he just wanted it ended. So it says, then Saul took his sword and fell on it. He committed suicide. There's no pretty way of putting this. That's what this was. He wanted it over. He didn't want to deal with what might be worse. And yet, right at the end of his life, he chose to end it without any form of repentance, without any turning back to God. He had strayed so far from God that this was how he chose to end it. So then it says, when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his own sword and died with him. Why? Because once again, he had no way of going home and explaining how the king had died. And he knew probably that the treatment that was going to come to him because of Saul's death was more than he could bear too. Or else, possibly, he feared the Philistines would come and deal with him one way or another. It wasn't going to be good. And so he went out the same way Saul did and took his own life. And so, in verse 6, it says, so on that day Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men. Now, when it says all his men, it's as I pointed out before, many of them had already fallen by the sword. Otherwise, they would have continued protecting Saul. But that was no longer the case. And Saul knew it was only a matter of time before somebody else came and either finished it or took him captive. And so on that day, it's recorded that all of his men and all of his sons, and he died. And as I read through some different thoughts from some different commentators, one pointed out that the sad truth here is that the righteous die with the unrighteous. And yet it's eternity that's going to separate them. And it doesn't say that Jonathan had done any wrong, or maybe, Saul's other sons, or maybe some of Saul's other men. But we see the heart of Saul, and we know that probably once his death came, he and his sons were forever separated. And that is sad. When I look in the New Testament and look in some other areas, and I think about the verse that says that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Sometimes we all endure the same suffering, the same battles, the same storms in life. But ultimately, eternity is what separates. We have a hope that extends beyond the battle. We have a hope that extends beyond the storm. And that's what gives us our thing to move on. That endurance that we get is who we have our hope and our faith in. And yet we see that his sons were killed. But we see that Saul, with none of this hope, with none of this foundation in the Lord, just thought there's no other way and ended it. And it was a very, very sad day. It says in verse 7, when the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and on the other side of the Jordan saw that Israel's men had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. So the Philistines came and settled in them. Again, another very sad day where those who owned the land, had the land settled, now sees their king dead. They see all of his sons dead. So what is their response? They abandon everything they have and run. And run. So what do the Philistines do? They move right on in and take it. And interesting, because if you go back and you go before Saul, before Israel even had a king, Israel was victorious in battle. Why? Because God was the one who controlled what they did. God was the one behind what they did. God was the one who they put their faith in. And when I look at this land that they have, it was a land that God led them to and gave them. And yet the day came when they wanted to be like everybody else. and they wanted a king. And they put all their faith in this king. And now here it is. This king has strayed so far from God. He's ended his own life. And they're in a battle they don't feel they can win. And quickly they're abandoning the land that God gave them because they've put their hope and their faith in a king, an earthly king, who didn't fear the Lord, who didn't follow the Lord. And that's where their hope was. So it says in verse 8, and this is where this starts to become a movie that I wouldn't watch, okay? It says, the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, so this was normal, the Philistines would come through and whoever was laying there dead, they would take anything they had on them to keep it, you know? So when they're doing this, they found Saul and his 3 sons dead on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to spread the good news in the temples of their idols and among the people. Boy, word spread fast the victory that the Philistines had won. They had the king. He was dead. They had his head as a trophy. They had all of his armor. And they were like, spread the news. And it got even better. Not only do we have him, we've got all his boys. We've taken this. We've won. This is where they were. And so it says in verse 10, then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and hung his body on the wall of Bethshan. So they take all his armor and they put it in the temple of their gods. Now, this was a pretty common practice of all of them. If you recall, in the story where David goes into the priest and he's asking if they have anything to eat, you know, that's where that Doeg guy shows up and he kind of rats out, hey, I saw David. This is where he was. Well, David also asked the priest something before he left. He said, do you have any weapon, a sword? And the priest is like, well, yeah, the sword from Goliath that you got. And so we see the priest willingly give that Goliath sword back to him. And David takes it. So this was common that when a nation would win a victory over something like this, they would take their weapon, their armor, their something, and they would take it and leave it in their temple as kind of saying, okay, our God or our gods gave us this victory. And so how sad that suddenly Israel's king's armor is now in the temple of pagan gods. I mean, this just doesn't seem to get any worse. And then we see that obviously he's lost his head, and it says they hung his body on the wall headless. I mean, this would have been into the, basically on the wall entering the city. This was their prize. This is what they had accomplished. This is what they had done. And what a sad, sad end for a king, especially the king of God's people. Very, very sad end. But we see in verse 11 that when the residents of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, that all of their brave men set out, they journeyed all night and retrieved the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. Now, they said that kind of how they can figure approximately where these locations would have been, it would have been about a 10-mile journey. This was not something that was going to be easy for these men. And they, of course, had to do it with the cover of night to get there. But these men could not stand the thought that their king, headless, was still on display for all of the Philistines to mock and to rejoice over. So they travel all night, and they retrieved the body of Saul and the body of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. And when they arrived at Jabesh, they burned the bodies there. Now, there's something to be said. The Hebrews did not burn bodies, okay? There were proper burials that were made. However, how bad this situation had gotten was the fact that they feared maybe the Philistines coming back and taking the body. They had no good way. The bodies had already been mutilated so bad, they were not in a place where they felt they could go give them a proper burial. So at this point, they found it of more respect to just burn the bodies and then take the bones. And it says afterwards, they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and then they fasted 7 days. They did the proper mourning, the proper fasting for someone lost. And they tried in the best way that they could to pay respect to their king. They tried in the best way they could. But even so, the way this whole thing had gone down, the way it all had happened, they couldn't even do a proper burial of the king and his sons, the way it had all happened. And so we find the end of 1 Samuel. We find the beginning and the end of the life of Saul. And when we take David and we set him over here, and we focus on the life of Saul, we find a very, very, very sad story of someone who was once in God's favor and strayed so far away. Someone who let jealousies and resentments and all of that overtake him to the point of seeking out a witch, to the point of ending his own life. And it's just, when I think about what so many are dealing with, what so many are struggling with, we as a church have to realize that their only hope is God. And that often the only way these ones who just feel like they are going down this path that they just don't, it's gotten so bad they don't even know how to deal with it anymore, that they need God. And when I think that God has chosen his children to be the ones to go show them that hope, to be that example, to share with them who Jesus is. Wow, that he entrusts that to us. And I think, boy, how good of a job are we doing? We really need to step it up. Because sometimes I feel like all we do is, wow, that's sad. Oh, that's rough. And yet we must do more. We must do more. You know, I had this conversation with someone earlier today, and we were talking about, you know, the concentration camps and the Jews and what Hitler did. And it was a time where the governments were out of control and they were doing things, and the people felt helpless. And probably many believers felt helpless, and nobody knew what to do. So they did nothing. They did nothing and just watched it happen. And I feel like more than ever we are at a time where if the church doesn't make a stand and doesn't do something, we're going to watch many individuals go down the same path as Saul. We're going to watch many of our leaders, God forbid, go down that same path of control and jealousies and just power. And the church has to, first of all, get on their knees and pray, and then get busy telling others. Or we will see more suicides, more drug overdoses, more, more power plays. And we see where that leads. Because ultimately, we've got the whole book of 1 Samuel. And it shows a man in his prime ultimately committing suicide and being hung on a wall for display. That's where that life leads. And we have something we can offer them. So 2 Samuel starts with David getting news of this. And so then we kind of pick back up with David's story. So remember, David's been off getting back what was his, that the Amalekites took. And it says in chapter 1, verse 1, after the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites. So keep in mind, this is saying after the death of Saul. So understand, simultaneously, this Philistine battle was going on over here with the Israelites, and David was over here fighting with the Amalekites. So we've got two battles going on at the same time. So after the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites, and he stayed at Ziklag 2 days. So keep in mind, he had only been back for 2 days, which gives us some idea that, remember, the Amalekites had destroyed the city, so they were probably trying to clean up and start fixing things up and dealing with the mess now that everyone was back. And it says in verse 2, on the 3rd day, a man with torn clothes and dust on his head came from Saul's camp. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David asked him, "Where have you come from?" So he replied to him, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." So here's this man, and he's dirty, and his clothes are torn, and he completely looks like he is just, full of grief and mourning and sorrow, and he falls at David's feet and kind of bows to him, and David is going, "Where have you come from?" He's trying to figure this out. Who is this man who looks like he's just dealing with all this pain and heartbreak? And so when the man says, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp," we see David's urgency. In verse 4, "What was the outcome? Tell me," David asked him. You can imagine, probably while fighting the Amalekites, David's still thinking, "I wonder what's going on. I wonder what's happening. I wonder how they're doing. What's going on?" So suddenly here's this man, and David is quick to ask, "What's happening? What's going on? What was the outcome? What happened?" So the troops fled from battle. He answered, "Many of the troops have fallen and are dead, and also Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." So the man gives the report, "Listen, a lot of the troops are dead. The rest of them ran away. But more importantly, Saul and his sons are dead." So David then asks the young man who had brought him the report, he said, "How do you know Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" So David, being the very wise man, young man that he is, he's first of all going, how do you know they're dead? Where'd you get your information? Already, David, I'm sure, has a pretty good idea of how war and battle and all of that goes. So where'd this guy get his information? Plus, we're going to find out pretty soon this was not a Hebrew, okay? And so David's questioning this a little bit. So he responds in verse 6, and he said, he just happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And at that very moment, the chariots and the cavalry were closing in on him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, so I answered, 'I'm at your service.' And he asked me, 'Who are you?' And I told him, 'I'm an Amalekite.'" Now remember who David was just out fighting? Yeah, the Amalekites, who, by the way, again, were a forever enemy that God told Saul to wipe out. They were not supposed to be left. All of them were a problem. That could be a study in and of itself, because the Amalekites are kind of a representation, and like I said, this is a whole other study, but the Amalekites are kind of like a representation of sin. And God doesn't say leave a little bit of it and get rid of a little bit of it. God doesn't say play with it a little bit. God doesn't say let a little bit in and make them part of your home. God said wipe them out. And so when we see the way that the Israelites dealt with God's command against the Amalekites, that was kind of God's example of this is how you deal with sin, is you still let it go on. You don't take care of it. So this is kind of something that's at play. So he said, I told him I'm an Amalekite. So then this Amalekite, he continues in verse 9, and he says, then he begged me. So he's saying, Saul begged me, stand over me and kill me, for I'm mortally wounded, but my life still lingers. So I stood over him and I killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he couldn't survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armband that was on his arm, and I've brought them here to my Lord. So suddenly he's offering this crown that was on his head and this armband that would have been signature something of the king. And he said, I took this and now I've brought this to you. And it says in verse 11 that David took hold of his clothes and tore them. And all the men with him did the same. They mourned, They wept and they fasted until evening for those who had died by the sword, for Saul, his son Jonathan, the Lord's people, in the house of Israel. They just went into a deep, deep state of mourning. Now I paused for a moment and I thought, I wonder what this Amalekite thought when he saw David's deep sorrow. Because we just read how Saul ended his life. So we saw that story before, now didn't we? And there was no Amalekite in the story. There was no young man who just happened to come over a hill and see this scene and have the king beg him to kill him. So this was probably somebody who come along and saw what had happened and kind of put two and two together and quickly stole something off of the king and thought, I'm going to take this to David and I'm going to get in his favor and he's going to be thrilled that I took out his enemy. He is going to be absolutely thrilled I did this. But that wasn't David's response at all. David tears his clothes. I mean, he is so overwhelmed with sorrow and grief. Because no matter what Saul had done to him, David still respected him, still honored him, and still loved him. And he goes into this deep, deep mourning. So then in verse 13, David inquired of the young man who had brought them the report. He said, "Where are you from?" Now, didn't the young man already put that in part of his story? See, David's like, yeah, remind me. Remind me, who are you and where have you come from? And he said, I'm the son of a resident alien. I'm an Amalekite. So his claim is that, I've been embraced and I'm the son of someone who's now been, embraced by the Hebrews and we live in Israel and this is our land and, but I'm an Amalekite. So David, okay, that's who you are. That's what I thought you said. I can kind of see this. And his anger is growing. So we've gone from grief to, the messenger. So David questioned him in verse 14. He said, how is it that you are not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? He said, who do you think you are that you could raise a hand against the one that God anointed? Like, do you know what you've done? Now, I can imagine, whoa. I mean, this Amalekite thought he had come up with this really good story that was going to put him in good favor with David. And sure, we know the rumors were flying that David was going to be the next king. And, hey, I'm just bringing the good news, and I helped you out. I even finished him off for you. It's wide open for you now. And he found such pride and such arrogance in this story that he made up. And now suddenly David's going, who do you think you are that you have the right to do that? That you have the right to take the Lord's anointed into your own hands to destroy him. That is not your place. And I just stopped and I pondered and I thought and I just weighed that and I thought, how often do we, think that it's our job to handle somebody who's out of control, to take them down? Never? Got to say, I've grown up in church and I've watched all those nice people. And, you get a pastor who's out of control and the church suddenly decides it's their job to take him out. How much different would this be if the church decided to all get on their knees and say, Lord, if you put this one in this place and they have strayed so far from you, you need to deal with them. And the church stayed on their knees until God dealt with them. But no. That's not how we act at all. Nope, we have meetings, we have discussions, we talk about it, and then we handle it, right? And expect God to bless us. And I often question, do we have the right to lay our hand on God's anointed? Who do we think we are? And you know what? Sometimes they're human, they stray, And it's only by the grace of God that that none of us do. That we don't get so puffed up with pride and arrogance that we stray that far from God. And the church, we're just so loving. And we just lovingly handle them right out the door. That's what we do. And we think we're okay and we're somehow justified. But David, here's David. Do you know how badly he was treated by Saul? I mean, we've been through that, haven't we? Chapter after chapter of Saul hunting him down. Hunting him down. David's gotten word that Saul has sent the order to go kill all the priests of God. I mean, if anybody deserved revenge, David did. If anyone, so maybe David didn't get revenge, and so David played it good the whole time, but of all things, certainly now, David can have a little bit of joy that his enemy is done, right? That's not his attitude at all. He's full of grief and sorrow. Why? Because David's heart maybe was a heart bent on Saul changing. Maybe David's heart was, boy, I wish I could have the relationship with him and Jonathan that I used to have. Saul had taken everything from him. Saul had given him his daughter as his wife and then ended up giving her to another man and ripped her right away from David. I mean, Saul had done a lot of harm to David, and yet we find no revenge, no hate, just love, and then heartbreak that they're now gone. And he turns and he looks at this man and he says, who do you think you are, that you think this is your job? So I took this and I took it outside of the church, and I'm going to go there just for a minute. And I had to think of those who are at the top, whether it be in our state government or our federal government. And again, whether we like it or not, they're in those positions. And it is not our job to raise a battle. It's our job to pray and say, God, you do this, if they're a problem. And more so, it's God change their heart. Because it is not a place where we look at our enemies and we always are bent on, God, take them out. But if only it was, God, change their heart. Draw them to you. And we need to learn to love the way Jesus loved. And when I look at David and I think this was a man who God said, he's truly a man after my own heart, I see that here. Because instead of being relieved, excited, any of those emotions that his enemy was done hunting him forever, instead, he's gone through mourning to now anger. To anger. How dare you? So in verse 15 it says, then David summoned one of his servants and said, come here and kill him. So the servant struck him and he died. For David had said to the Amalekite, your blood is on your own head, because your own mouth testified against you by saying, I killed the Lord's anointed. David saying, listen, this is your fault. You did this. You came in here arrogantly boasting about what you had done. Did David know the guy was lying? I don't know. Probably not. But his lie took him right to his death. Because what he thought was something to be so proud of, and certainly David would be excited, nope, it was something that ended his life. And David's saying, it's on you. Maybe David was saying, listen, had you done it and just gone home and shut up, I wouldn't have known about it. But now you're going around arrogant about what you've done and proud of what you've done. Now I think about everything we've just talked about, how we think it's our job. And then when they're done, whoo, look what we did. And we're so proud of ourselves for acting awful. I mean, really, it's just like, wow, what have we done? We want to pat each other on the back. Not our job. And David said, yeah, your blood is on your own hands. You've done this to yourself by coming in here and boasting about what you have done. So then we're not going to turn to the Psalms because we see David's poetry, we see David's heart. This time we get to see all of that poured out right here in the book of Samuel. And so then this continues in verse 17, and it said, David sang the following lament for Saul and his son Jonathan. And he ordered that the Judahites be taught the song of the bow, and it is written in the book of Jashar. So this was something that was so heavily on David's heart, and then he ordered that they all sing this, that they all know this, that they all put this to memory. It was that important for David. And he said, you all need to mourn what has happened. You all need to realize what has happened. You all need to reflect on what has happened. Now, why was that important? Because this nation's leader had turned away from God. And the whole nation had paid for that. The just and the unjust. They had all paid for Saul's straying. They had all paid in battle. They had all lost loved ones. They were now in a place where are we going to go from here? And David's heart was saying, listen, you all need to memorize this. You need to put this to heart, and you need to realize where you've been so that you can move forward. And so it goes to say in verse 19, David begins with, the splendor of Israel lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. He reminds them, listen, the splendor of Israel, your king, the one you put all your faith in, he lays dead in the midst of battle. He says, do not tell it in Gath. Don't announce it in the marketplace of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, and the daughters of the uncircumcised will celebrate. His song gives the message to them, listen, you don't go around and talk about this. You don't in any way, shape, or form glorify this. Nothing. Because if you do, listen, those Philistines are already rejoicing over what they've done. David knew full well what it was to come home after he had won a great war against the Philistines. Remember the songs the women used to sing? Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. He knew the rejoicing that went on when a great, leader was taken down because he had done it. And he said, listen, we are not going to talk about this. We are not giving them anything to be proud of. This is a sad day, what has happened. And he says in verse 21, mountains of Gilboa, let no dew or rain be on you, or fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled. It's almost like wishing a curse upon that whole region, upon that whole land. And he's saying, listen, may no dew or rain or fields of offering. He's saying, I hope nothing grows there. I hope the land becomes barren, destitute, and there's nothing there to even offer as an offering to the Lord, because that is a sad place. And I hope that the place is even marked with the sadness and something that happened there that should have never happened to God's people. But it happened because they had strayed from the Lord. So he says, the shield of Saul no longer anointed with oil. Now we know that Samuel anointed the king with oil. Samuel anointed Saul, and then Samuel anointed David. But here was the life of Saul, who was no longer in that place of favor with the Lord, who was no longer in that position. And we know that his armor was carried off and put in the temple of a pagan god. And for this, David cries. David mourns. David weeps. He finds no joy in this, no honor in this, nothing to be excited about. He weeps, and he tells the others, you need to be weeping too. You need to put it here, what has happened. He says, Jonathan's bow never retreated. Saul's sword never returned unsustained from the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty. He said, listen, do you remember who Saul and Jonathan used to be? Do you remember the victories? Nothing could stop them. They fought together in battle, and God protected them, and God gave them victory. Don't you remember how they used to fight? He's not sitting here talking about the Saul of, the day before. He's not talking about the Saul that hunted him through the mountains. He's not talking about that Saul. He instead is choosing to say, do you remember the Saul from the good days? Do you remember the Saul that followed the Lord? We need to mourn that that Saul is no longer here, and because of that, he's gone. David doesn't choose to sit and focus on the bad aspects of Saul's life, but rather the good aspects. Is that what we do with our enemy? We just focus right in on the things that bother us. We never look at the good. Saul, he says in verse 23, he says, Saul and Jonathan loved and delightful. They were not parted in life or in death. He said, you know what? They fought together. They fought in these battles, and they fought all the way to the point where then they died together. And for David, we know that Jonathan was his closest friend, and we're going to see that poured out in this. And yet, here is Jonathan, so loyal and so close, and David feels that closeness, and yet David totally respects the fact that Jonathan was also right here, fighting alongside his father and being loyal to his father. And David respected that about Jonathan. And he said, here they were, they fought together side by side the whole time, and now they've died together. He said they were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. He has nothing but honor and praise for Saul and David. Now, if I were to ask any of you here in the room or those watching at home, if you were to really just sit and talk to me about your enemy, I kind of doubt it would be so full of praise. Kind of doubt it would be able to be something that you would be able to put all that aside and remember that this person had good about them. But that life and circumstances and power and control or jealousies or whatever it was, what it was the enemy. The enemy got a hold of them and destroyed them. Have a thought? Absolutely. And for those who can't hear at home, I agree with you that, yes, David still loved Saul. And I do think there was a part, and we even see from those instances where he's hunting down David, and David kind of snuck up and did this or did that, and we see Saul overwhelmed. We saw that moment where Saul could kind of reflect on, what am I doing? But his jealousy and all these other emotions had just so consumed him, he couldn't see past it. It just all had overtaken him. And I think that even the people, and no doubt the 600 men that were with David, I'm sure saw Saul as an enemy. But there was something so much deeper. At one point, David had been in close relationship with the whole family. He was family. He sat at Saul's table. Yeah, he had played the harp through many things that Saul was struggling with. He loved Saul and had at many times been able to bring comfort to Saul. And I'm sure those were very close, intimate times between the two of them. And so in this moment, David could have been caught up with all the years of running and all these other things. And David could have let anger creep in, that this is what this had resulted in. But he didn't. He chose to keep his heart humble before God and to see Saul as something else. And he loved Saul. And if only we could set aside those other feelings and those other things that we have going on, and with a pure heart, just love those whom Jesus loves, regardless of what they're doing, and see them through Jesus' eyes. And so often we just think, man, they're just rotten to the core. There's nothing good about them. You know what? If only we walked in their shoes and knew the life they had lived, we just might have a small taste of what had driven them to what they did. And we might be able to find that love. But because we can't always see that, we make quick judgments and the love it's out the window. When we especially look at the bigger scene, when I talk about our governments and these bigger things and the media and all of that, it's just so easily when it comes to that realm to be overcome by anger over issues and different things. And suddenly we're so consumed with all this other stuff, love's out the window. It's not even a discussion anymore. And the thought of praying for them and pleading to God for these circumstances, we just forget all about it. Suddenly the topics become much bigger. And I'm going to tell you, when I look at it right now, I don't care which side you're on, I don't care what party, our nation needs prayer. And if the church doesn't do it, I fear that we may be in a day where God says, okay, then I'll hand you over to it all, because you have not turned to me and you have not cried out to me. And when you study the Old Testament and you see that heart of God, you realize it was a heart of love for his people to turn back to him. And I just pray that the church will open up their eyes before God says, I'm giving you over. And the just will fall with the unjust, because that's how it goes. And for those who argue that, well, then please explain Daniel to me. Because that man was a man who was faithful to God all the way to the end. All the way to the end, and yet he was still marched off into captivity with everyone else. And so when we look at this and we see the love of David and we see the heart of David, he says, daughters of Israel, in verse 24, he said, daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxurious things, who decked your garments with gold ornaments. He said, listen, don't you forget, Israel, what Saul has done for you. Don't you forget what he has built for you. Saul has been a good king to you. Don't forget it. Don't forget it now with this. Don't let this be how Saul is marked in your brains forever. Don't forget what he's done for you. He said, how the mighty have fallen in the thick of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. He says, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were such a friend to me, and your love for me was more wondrous than the love of a woman. So right at the end of this song, this poetry, this lament, this cry, we see that friendship brought back up. We see it end on Jonathan. And he cries out just from a place of a complete broken heart. He knows and feels that he'll never have a friend as dear, as close, as true and honest as Jonathan. And his heart cries. He said, you loved me more than any other woman could ever even love me. I mean, the love you have for me is so deep, a woman couldn't even love me this way. The closeness, the bond that we have. And he just cries. And he ends this in verse 27 with, how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. Now that weapons of war that he mentioned there, that's symbolic of Saul and Jonathan. That they were used by God as a weapon to sustain and to fight and to protect Israel, and now they're gone. They're gone. And not only does David mourn, but all of David's men mourn, and then this goes on to Israel, and he says, you need to mourn. And there comes a time when God's people need to stop, and they need to realize what has happened, they need to realize what has been done, and they need to get on their knees, and they need to mourn, and they need to cry, and they need to realize where they've come from, where they were, and then they suddenly got here. And it's in recognizing that we were once this, and yet somehow we've strayed and we've gotten to this point. And we must first get on our face and lament over that, cry over that, realize, and then get back up and say, not anymore. We've turned back to God. And this is what David called all the people to. And David mourned. And we see many things in here. We see the fall of Saul. We see the lying, wicked young man who decides in all of his arrogance that it's his job to, take somebody down, or even though he really didn't. But we see a lot of different dynamics going on. And I hope and pray that the one we learn from the most, and if we recognize that we have any of these other behaviors, that we realize, no, David is the one, the example, the heart after God that we need to have. And I just pray that, again, as I look at this and I think all of this going on even now and here in our nation, in our world, whether it's at the top level or whether it's in individual homes in our communities, there is a battle that's going on and an enemy that's very real that wants to destroy. He wants to destroy our kids, our maybe not so much kids. He wants to make them feel like there is no way out of their troubles, of their, stresses. And then he wants to fill you with pride and arrogance, anything he can to take you out and destroy you. And the church should not only not be a part of it, but we should be on our knees praying and loving people. So, any thoughts before I close? Absolutely. Right. And I think, to your point, for those listening at home, he was talking about, we call ourselves a Christian nation, and yet think we're just this strong nation, and we have this strong military and this strong whatever, and nobody could take us down. And yet if God removes his hand, it could happen overnight. And I think that that's the big warning in this story, is this was a nation who had decided they needed a king like everybody else. And they had put all their faith and all of their hope in this king. And we see what happened to the king. He bent under pressure. He couldn't fulfill what the people needed. And it got to him. It got to him. And we put all our hope in who's president? Well, they're either going to be so full of arrogance and so full of pride and whatever that they'll be destroyed. We put our hope and our whatever in our military. Oh, God forbid. Because when we put our hope in any of these things, we have a jealous God who says, remember me. Remember me. Because you're putting it in all these other things and you've forgotten me. And he has a way of drawing his people back by reminding them that they've forgotten him. And that's a scary thing. And something that I've been raised with, I have no problem with fear of the Lord. I see the whole thing. And although my God is a God of love, he is a God that is to be feared. Because when I disobey and when I stray, he disciplines his kids. Why? So he can draw them back into right relationship with him. He wants us back. And I take that very seriously. And just like David, so often in the Psalms, where did he desire to be? Under the wings of his God, close by his side. And that's where we need to remain. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, we come to you, and we thank you for your word. And we know that sometimes your word cuts right to the heart. And it calls us to stand up and take a look in the mirror at where we are and what we've done. I pray, Lord, that you would just bring your church revival. Help us to realize maybe what we've done and where we've failed. And help us to fully turn back to you united. Lord, I just pray that. And I just pray for our nation, for our leaders, for our churches, and the leaders there. Just give them boldness to stand for truth and for what is right. And Lord, I just pray that in this world that is just so fallen, We know who is the prince and the power of this earth and who is very, very, very hard at work. And I just pray, Lord, that we would still put our hope and our faith and our trust and find our rest in the one who has won, who is still over it all. I thank you for being that God. And I thank you for these stories that remind us, and that these stories also tell us that, there's nothing new under the sun. These are still warnings for today. And it's still very relevant today. I thank you and praise you for that you have given us your word. Pray that you would help us to keep this in our hearts, and Lord, that this would be something that would change us as we continue to go throughout our week. I thank you for those ones who were here and for this sweet fellowship that we have here tonight. And I pray that you would bless them, and even the ones at home watching, I just pray that you would bless them and just be with each one of us through these trying times. Help your church to still be a light in the midst of all that's going on. Help us to realize that COVID or not, we can still be used of you. I thank you and praise you and pray that you would take us from this place. In your holy and precious name, amen.